This is co-counseling training video 1. And if you're in a co-counseling class, which you don't need to be, but if you're in a co-counseling class, this video will go with what's covered in your very first class. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the nuts and bolts of how do you actually do a co-counseling session. So the first thing is to decide who's going to go first and how long your session is going to be. So I recommend that people try once a week to get a session where each person gets a turn of at least 45 minutes. Somebody might have a preference to go first, somebody might have a preference to go second, or you might just flip a coin and decide randomly. Once you decide who's going first, it's the counselor's job to run the session through its phases. And I'm going to explain the 4 phases of a co-counseling session. First, the counselor, the person who's in the counseling role first, sets a timer. And you're going to set it for the length of the person's turn minus 5 minutes. So if the person's turn is going to be 45 minutes, you set the timer for 40. You may use a timer on your phone, but I'm going to highly recommend that you get a kitchen timer or some other kind of digital timer. I actually encourage people to keep their phones away from themselves and off, or at least on silence where you don't even hear it vibrate, like in a different room during a co-counseling session, because phones have become so severely distracting to people that it's going to distract both counselor and client to have a phone around, and particularly if you can hear the notifications. It's going to be especially distracting to the counselor because they can't look, whereas the client could always just look and see what it is. But then that's going to knock them off track. So ideally, phones off, at the very least, in a different room so you don't hear them. So it's better to have a kitchen timer. You're using a timer on your phone, then your phone is such a source of distractions and such a source of anxiety. Like things can come up on there that are suddenly going to make you anxious. So kitchen timer costs you $5 or whatever at the store, and I really encourage you to have it, just a regular digital timer. So whatever timer you're using, you set it for 5 minutes less than the length of the turn, and you set it to have an audible beep because you want the client to be able to hear the beep. And if you're co-counseling by phone or by Zoom, put the timer somewhere where the sound of it is really going to come across, because the client may be in mid-sentence when the timer goes off, and you may not want to cut them off in the middle of a sentence and say, oop, 5 minutes left, or your time is up, or whatever it is. And so if they can hear the beep themselves, then you won't have to interrupt them to tell them. So you set the timer, you start the timer, and you say to the client, what's new and good? That's how every session begins, with the question, what's new and good? Or however you want to ask that. What's something that's good that's happened lately? What have you been in a good mood about lately? What's something that's been positive in the last few days or weeks of your life? We start the session with something positive. It's about strength gathering. It's not about, let's look on the bright side. It's not about how everything has to be cheery. It can push certain people's buttons that we start with something always that's positive. Push through that. Try to push through if you're getting your buttons pushed by that, because it's not about, in any sense, running away from what's rough. It's about preparing ourselves to do successful work. We can muck around endlessly in what's rough and what's miserable. We've done plenty of that. The point is to be able to go into what's rough in a way where it's actually likely to move, in a way where we're actually likely to have some success processing it. And one of the ways we do that is by getting ourselves on some solid ground first. And so that's why we start the session with things that have been positive. I encourage you to spend a decent amount of time on this, 4, 5, 6 minutes, trying to remember things that have gone well and try to feel them, try to connect with them. If you're in the client role, try to celebrate them a little bit. Really be with them for a minute and let them soak into you. If you're the counselor, when it's been 4, 5, 6 minutes, you feel like the person has come up with some decent examples of some things that have been good to them lately, and you can see them getting buoyed up a little bit by thinking about these things. Then you go to the second phase of the session, which we call minor challenges or minor upsets, or for humor, we sometimes like to refer to as micro disasters. What are some things that have gone on lately that have been kind of upsetting or annoying, but they're not that big, or at the very least, they're not what you would want to focus on today? So we spend another 4, 5, 6 minutes on these minor upsets, minor challenges part of the session. So that's phase 2. We do this for a couple of reasons. One is that by giving just brief attention to some of the smaller issues or side issues in our lives, it helps to clear them to the side so that we'll be more able to focus most of our time on whatever it is that we really want to work on that day. The other advantage is it's kind of like getting into the water gradually, like rather than just like diving right into things that are big for us, we sort of deal with a few smaller things first, sort of prove to ourselves that we can handle it, we're good, and on we go. That's from the client's perspective. Okay, so now we're 8, 10, 12 minutes into the session, and the counselor is going to say, so what do you want to focus on today? What's on top, we might ask, is one way to say it. Or what could really use your attention today? What do you want to go after? What's been weighing on you? Any of those questions, however you want to phrase it is fine. But the point is, what are you going after today? Sometimes the client won't know. And so then you may spend a few minutes trying to figure out, so do you want to focus on something that's been bothering you? And if so, what has been bothering you lately? Or is this a good week to focus more on things that you have had successes or have been enjoying lately? Would you rather do that? And do a little digging around, exploring until the person comes to a place where they can say, yeah, you know what, this is what I want to talk about today. It doesn't usually take very long. Even if the person didn't know at first, it doesn't usually take very long for them to say, you know what, I think this is what I want to talk about today. And often they'll know right away what they want to talk about. So that's the bulk of the session, the phase 3 here, the what you might call the main course. And that's going to go until your beeper goes off. Your beeper is going to go off with 5 minutes left in the session. And so this is going to be just what the main issue is that they want to focus on for that day. And how to use that time, you learn all kinds of things about from the co-counseling manual or from being in a class. But what you're going to focus on for now is just the client just get to talk and tell about whatever they want to talk and tell about. If they start to feel feelings, just let them have space to feel their feelings, even encourage them, say, go ahead and feel that. Or if they're crying, just say, go ahead and let those tears come. That's all you got to do when you're in the counseling role. When you're new to co-counseling, and actually even when you're very experienced in co-counseling, this is still going to be the main thing you're going to do is give the client your completely undivided, caring attention and keep the focus on the client. And what that means is during the other person's turn, you do not talk at all about yourself. And that means that you don't do it even to be supportive. And that's going to be a tough habit to break because we tend to have habits of showing our support for people by talking about ourselves. For example, by saying, oh yeah, I've been through something so similar. Here's what happened to me. Boom, 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 boom. That's fine in normal conversation. It can even really be helpful in normal conversation. We don't do it in co-counseling for a number of different reasons. So co-counseling is a time when we're agreeing this person's turn is 100% about them, and I'm not going to talk about myself at all during the other person's turn. I might say, ooh, I really get what you're talking about, but I'm not going to say I get what you're talking about because the same thing happened to me. I'm going to ask you not to even do part 2 of that sentence. Don't even do the because the same thing happened to me. Again, tough habit to break, but really work at it. Work at nothing about me. The counselor's comments should be brief and supportive and should be about the client. Don't talk a lot because it's their turn. You don't want to take up their turn, even with your supportive comments. Just keep them brief. And keep them natural. Just say what you would say to a friend or any loved one that you cared about, except for not talking about yourself. So just say things like, oh, that sounds really hard, or oh, congratulations, that's great, or hoo-ha. You don't have to adopt a special counselor-like personality. And if you've been in counseling, you may have these images of how a counselor should talk or sound. Try not to do that stuff. Just be yourself. The only thing I'm asking you to change is that you keep the focus entirely on the client and that you keep your comments brief. Oh, I can really understand why you would feel that way. That's totally natural given what you've been through. That kind of thing. Or oh, I'm right with you. I'm really hearing you. Yeah, I'm really understand. Or, hey, yeah, that's all. That's it. Brief supportive comments. Okay, the beeper has gone off. The person's got 5 minutes left. Counselor now needs to move us into the fourth phase of the session, which we call present time, or we call attention out. And those are just two different terms, mean exactly the same thing. They just mean anything heavy that the person worked on, we're going to try to help the person rise out and get back into a focus on life. And one of our philosophies in co-counseling is that life is much more interesting than distress is. And we want to take times to focus on our distress, but consciously chosen times. Parts of the week that we've selected, like this is going to be the time that we focus on our distress and try to heal it and process it. And then when our session's over, we're going to try to rise out of it and leave it behind. And this is one of the many ways that co-counseling is quite different from what goes on in many professional therapeutic approaches, because a professional therapist not uncommonly will tell you, okay, this has been a really interesting session today. Some interesting issues have come up. Why don't you really sit with these things this week and let them rattle around inside you and see where it goes? And in co-counseling, we're generally going to say, try not to do that. Try to have consciously chosen times during your week set aside to be with painful stuff, to look at distress, and then try the rest of the week not to be in it. Our philosophy is that when you mix healing and living together, it tends to come out as not very effective healing and as not very effective living. And it's better to be quite intentional about when we're going to do our healing work, and then the rest of the time try to be as up and out of that stuff as we can, and be interested in life, be interested in our interests, be interested in the world, be interested in helping heal the world and change injustices. There's just so many fascinating and amazing things in the world that are so much more interesting and fun and satisfying than distress. So that's what the last 5 minutes are about. We call it present time because we've usually been working on things from the past. Well, we've always been working on things from the past, even if they're from 3 hours ago. We're working on things from the past. Now we're trying to get our attention back into the present moment. Living in the present, right? Everybody says you want to live in the present. So that's why we use the term present time, or we use the term attention out, because our attention during our turn has been inward. Now we want to turn our attention back out into the world. So during this time, the counselor asks the client questions to redirect their attention into the world. And the one we most commonly use is, what are you looking forward to? Just helps them think about things that are potentially fun or satisfying, meaningful, that are coming up in the time ahead. But our other really common present time technique is to ask questions that are sensory in nature, that get the person thinking about sights or sounds or smells. So we'll ask, tell me 6 green things that you can see in the room if you look around you. Tell me as many things as you can see in the room around you that are made out of wood. Or tell me anything around in the room that you're in that looks pretty to you, or that looks like a nice craft or a nice design. Tell me the last really delicious meal you had, right? You're getting them thinking about smells and flavors if they're thinking about a recent meal. Tell me something about your favorite music. What's the last thing you really enjoyed listening to? So anything that uses all your different senses. And then just kind of fun or trivial questions will help bring a person up and out. And tell me 5 kinds of cheese you can think of. These are one of my favorites. I use these a lot. Tell me 5 breeds of horse. Tell me 7 breeds of dog. Tell me as many states in the United States as you can think of that start with the letter M. Just trivial kinds of things. I encourage people to make a present time box, and I just use some old empty tissue box, and then I write down all kinds of fun questions along the lines that I've just laid out for you, and I stick them in the box. So when I'm counseling with somebody, whether in person or by phone, when I'm in the counseling role and we're doing the present time part of the other person's turn, I can just dig in my little box, pull out a thing, and see what question I can come up with. All right, tell me about one of your favorite sweaters, and so forth. And then so that I don't have to be racing to come up with a present time question, because I've got a whole bunch of them in the present time box. So that's an approach I really encourage you to come up with. In the co-counseling manual, you'll find a whole list of possible questions to ask for present time. If you're in a class, you'll talk about it in detail in your class. So that's phase 4. Then time is up. If you need a break, someone needs to pee or get a drink of water, you take a couple minutes, and then it's time to switch to the other person's turn. So that's the structure of a co-counseling session. This session needs to be completely confidential. So nothing that person said to you during their turn is to be said anywhere else to anyone else. So you have to honor that. And in co-counseling, we actually extend confidentiality even beyond where you will encounter it in other ways, which is in co-counseling, we don't make reference to that session even to the person himself or herself that we were just co-counseling with. Now, this is an interesting idea. It's a new idea for most people, and so it'll take some getting used to. So what that means is once your turn is over, in fact, once the beeper's gone off, once we've even begun phase 4 of the session, once we've even begun the present time part of the session, I am no longer to mention anything you've talked about that day in your session. We call that referring to the person's session or commenting on their session, referring to their material. You'll hear different terms like that used, or bringing up their issues, whatever. We don't do that in co-counseling. Again, a professional therapist might very well do that. Say, oh, I think this connects to an issue you were talking about 3 weeks ago. None of that in co-counseling. If anything comes up from 3 weeks ago, it needs to be because the client brought it up, not because the counselor brought it up. We did not mention it. If the client brings it up, then it's fine as the counselor to say, oh yeah, I remember when you were talking about that when we were co-counseling before. But that's only because the client brought it up. You don't bring it up. And again, that's a new idea that's going to take some getting used to. You're likely to make some mistakes sometimes, but just get better and better at remembering. I don't refer back. And that means also try not to do summing up at the end of the session. That's another hard temptation to break. It'll take some getting used to. You'll probably make some mistakes, but try not to sum things up. Try not to wrap things up. Try not to say things at the end of the other person's session like, wow, you did some really good work today, or wow, you went into some really intense stuff today. It's like that you're at the part of the session now where it's time to be rising out, and you're pointing them back towards the down, back towards where they just came from. Like, wow, you really cried hard today. It's like, you're kind of pushing me back into where I just was. So we don't need to put it in a capsule for people. That's too much of a burden anyhow on the counselor. Let it go. End of the session. We're going up and out. So complete confidentiality, even with respect to that person. The client is in complete control of any issues they bring up, of when those issues will be brought up again, of when they'll be mentioned again. That actually helps us to open up much faster with each other, because there are certain vulnerable issues that are really raw for a person, issues that are really scary or issues that are really dark that, I'm not going to bring up with you if I have to worry that 3 weeks from now at a time when I don't want to hear about it, or it's like way too sensitive a day for me or whatever, you're going to mention it to me. Whereas if I have an understanding with you that it's never coming up again until I bring it up again, that's going to allow me to go to some places that are quite raw that otherwise I wouldn't feel safe to go. So we all really gain when we're disciplined about not referring to people's sessions. And I tend to be on people about it a fair bit. I tend to remind people if they're doing it, please don't do that, because the safety that we gain is so significant. And I know you lose certain things by not being able to bring stuff up from the past. The gains are so much greater. And then the other key point that I want to go over from co-counseling is a question of who is in charge of the session. And this is a slightly complicated one in co-counseling, so I'm going to ask you to bear with me as I explain this. It is the counselor's job to run the session. And you're going to be much more effective counselor, you're going to be much more helpful to your client if you run the session decisively, as if you were the boss. You move the session through its phases. You tell the client when it's time to do the next phase in those 4 phases that I took you through. You're in charge of the timer. You're not apologetic. You're not timid. You don't say, oh, is it okay if we do such and such? Or don't start the timer and then you're kind of quiet. It's like you start the timer, say, what's new and good? Like, boom, I'm in running the session. Try to unapologetically and decisively run the session. That's going to help your client feel cared about. It's going to help your client feel taken care of. It's going to help your client feel held. And it's really valuable. Now, what gets confusing for people is that I always say, and this is a principle of co-counseling also, that the client is the ultimate authority. So the counselor isn't really the boss. The client is the boss. But I'm still going to ask you, while you're in the counseling role, please act like the boss. It's up to the client to say, no, I don't want to do that today, or I'm too upset right now. I'm going to skip new and good and go straight for hard stuff because I'm so upset right now. It wouldn't even be meaningful for me to do new and good and minor challenges right now. And the client is the ultimate authority, but the counselor runs the session except when the client intercedes. And the image I give people, you'll see this in other things that I've written, is imagine that you're a store owner and you're hiring someone to manage the store. You're hiring someone to manage the store because you want them to manage the store, right? You don't want them calling you every 5 minutes saying, well, do you think I should put this in the front window, or should I do the display in the front window this other way? Or a customer's in asking such and such a thing, what should I tell them? It's like, I hired you to manage the store, manage the store. It's like, if I don't like what's in the front window, I'll let you know and we'll change it. If I am concerned about how you're interacting with customers, I'm going to raise it with you and we'll change it. But in the meantime, I want you to do the job because I hired you to do it. So the client is the owner of the store. The counselor is the manager. The owner of the store wants the manager to run the store decisively until the owner tells him to do something different. The client wants the counselor to decisively run the session until the client tells him to do something different. So try to struggle against timidity. You're naturally going to be a little bit timid when you're new. That's just completely understandable. Don't be impatient with yourself about it. I'm just saying keep working against it. Keep moving towards decisiveness. Keep being outspoken. Keep your voice strong. Try to keep the session moving through its phases. Now, there's a tremendous amount to learn about how to be an effective counselor. But this is the beginning point, is here's how we do a co-counseling session.